Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is part 3 of my series, Fraud in the National Climate Assessment. In this video, I'm going to go into more detail about some of the topics I've already discussed and show why there's such a serious problem. I'm going to start out by reading some of President Eisenhower's farewell speech from 1960. Research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor tinkering in a shop has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the Free University, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet, in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific and technological elite. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society. Nearly 60 years ago, President Eisenhower saw the writing on the wall. He saw the dangers of the federal government taking over scientific research and the dangers of federal money corrupting that research. He saw the dangers of computer models replacing thought. And most importantly, he saw the danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific and technological elite. President Eisenhower's 1960 speech has generally been referred to as his warning about the military-industrial complex. But he was also warning about the dangers of the scientific community being corrupted for political purposes. And that's exactly what we see in the National Climate Assessment. This is part of the climate-industrial complex. I'm going to show you more detail now about just how corrupt this document is, and how it's being used in an attempt to take control of policy away from the president. There are lots and lots of names in this document, both of academics and from people in the federal government. President Trump has correctly been very critical of this document. And of course, the press and many politicians have been using this document to attack the president. The president's critics say that he's ignoring his own scientists. But that argument simply isn't true. These people aren't his scientists. These are holdovers from the Obama administration. President Obama wanted to be remembered as the guy who saved the world from global warming, so he appointed people who would assist him in delivering that message. At the top of the document, which goes out to the press and policymakers, is this paragraph: Causes of change. Scientists have understood the fundamental physics of climate change for almost 200 years. In the 1850s, researchers demonstrated that carbon dioxide and other naturally occurring greenhouse gases in the atmosphere prevent some of the heat radiating from Earth's surface from escaping to space. This is known as the greenhouse effect. There's so many things wrong with this paragraph, it's difficult to know where to begin. So I'm going to cover it from several different angles. Understanding the greenhouse effect helps scientists understand the radiative transfer properties of the atmosphere. I've done contract work for the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado on their radiative transfer models. So I'm very familiar with the fundamental principles of greenhouse gases and radiative transfer in the atmosphere. But radiative transfer is not climate change. The claim that scientists have understood climate change for 200 years is simply ridiculous, and I'm going to show you how ridiculous it is. This is a graph of temperatures and carbon dioxide levels in Antarctic ice cores going back for 450,000 years. The blue line is temperature, and the red line is carbon dioxide levels. You can see that over the last 450,000 years have been very large swings in temperature of more than 10 degrees centigrade. Temperatures were very warm about 130,000 years ago, about 240,000 years ago, about 320,000 years ago, and about 420,000 years ago. And in between these warm spells were ice ages, when glaciers covered much of North America and Europe. During the most recent ice age, about 20,000 years ago, Chicago and New York were buried under more than a mile of ice. Now let's look at the red line, which is carbon dioxide concentration. You can see that when the temperature goes down, carbon dioxide goes down. When the temperature goes up, carbon dioxide goes up. It's a very consistent pattern. We can see that there's a close correlation between temperature levels and carbon dioxide levels in the historical record. But climate scientists have completely misinterpreted the meaning of this. These climate scientists are trying to claim that small swings in carbon dioxide levels of a little over 100 parts per million are causing huge swings in temperature of more than 10 degrees centigrade. That's simply not plausible. No radiative transfer model shows anywhere near that large sensitivity between carbon dioxide and temperature levels. Obviously, there's something much larger driving the temperature than the carbon dioxide. But here's the real smoking gun that climate scientists don't know what they're talking about. Look at when the last ice age started. It started about 120,000 years ago when carbon dioxide was at its peak. And the ice age ended when carbon dioxide was at its minimum. And it's the same pattern all through the historical record. Ice ages always begin when CO2 is at its peak, and they always end when CO2 is at a minimum. If carbon dioxide was controlling the climate, these warm spells would keep getting warmer and warmer as CO2 increases, and the cold spells would keep getting colder and colder as CO2 decreases. But we see the exact opposite thing happening. So obviously what's controlling these cyclical patterns is something other than the carbon dioxide. I have degrees in engineering and geology, and one of the first things they teach you in geology school is that when the temperature goes up, atmospheric CO2 increases. And the reason for that is because warmer seawater can hold less carbon dioxide. So when the oceans warm, they outgas carbon dioxide and atmospheric CO2 levels increase. It's not the carbon dioxide levels driving the temperature, it's the temperature driving the carbon dioxide levels. As far as I can tell, many of the best-known climate scientists don't seem to have any understanding of the past climates of the Earth. If you want to understand past climate, the people to talk to are geologists, because much of geology depends on an understanding of climate. The next time you get into a discussion with a climate alarmist, ask them why ice ages begin when CO2 is at its peak and they end when CO2 is at its minimum. If greenhouse gases were controlling the climate as the National Climate Assessment claims, we would see the exact opposite thing happen. When CO2 was at its peak, it would just keep getting hotter and hotter. And when CO2 was at its minimum, it would keep getting colder and colder. But obviously there's something very powerful which is driving the climatic cycles, and it's not carbon dioxide levels. So this opening sentence in the National Climate Assessment is simply not true. Scientists have understood the fundamental physics of climate change for almost 200 years, and they say it's carbon dioxide. There's no validity to that statement. There are many, many different factors which cause the climate to change, and as recently as 40 years ago, climate scientists were predicting global cooling and a new ice age. Pretty sure that 40 years is less than 200 years ago. Now let's get back into the guts of the document and look at a graph we've already looked at, the U.S. Heatwave Graph, which shows heat waves increasing since the 1960s. And the graph is accompanied by this text. The season length of heat waves in many U.S. cities has increased by over 40 days since the 1960s. I'm going to show you again now why they picked the 1960s for their start point. This is a graph from a second document from the National Climate Assessment, not the one that generally goes out to policymakers and the press. And it shows something very different. It shows that warm spells were much greater prior to 1960. If we overlay the colored graph, which goes out to policymakers, on the other graph from the document which policymakers generally don't see, we see why they're hiding all the pre-1960 data, because it pretty much wrecks their claim that carbon dioxide is controlling the climate. You can see very clearly in the other graph that prior to 1960, warm spells were much greater in the United States than they are now. They don't want you to know about that, So they hide this part of the graph from the policymakers and the journalists. And here's one more graph from the United States Environmental Protection Agency right off their webpage. You can see once again that heat waves were much worse prior to 1960. And if we overlay the policymaker graph from the National Climate Assessment, you can see once again what they're hiding. So now let's take this discussion to the next level. The scientists who prepared this black and white graph for the National Climate Assessment, well, they must be outraged that the graph which goes out to policymakers misrepresents their work, and much more importantly, misrepresents the science. The actual data behind the National Climate Assessment and their own graph shows that when carbon dioxide levels were lower prior to 1960, heat waves were much worse. This completely wrecks the entire premise of their document. So where is this outrage from climate scientists that their work is being misrepresented and that the science is being misrepresented? Well, I can't find it anywhere. I've searched all over Google. I've searched the news. I can't find any climate scientists which are unhappy about this fraud being committed in the policymaker document. The climate scientists behind this document seem to be perfectly happy to allow their work to be misrepresented. This is exactly what Eisenhower warned about in 1960. We have a scientific and technological elite who are trying to take control of policy away from the president, and they're using some pretty spectacular junk science to enable it. So now let's look at some more detail of why the document, which goes out to lawmakers and journalists, doesn't have any information before 1960. Well, the reason is simple. It was cold in the 1960s. Here's an article from the New York Times, January 30th, 1961. Scientists agree world is colder. An assembly of specialists from several continents seems to have reached unanimous agreement on only one point. It's getting colder. Wow, that's 100% consensus. The Earth was cooling. And here's an article from 1963 from the Canberra Times. Glaciers grow in Norway. Norway's glaciers are in the process of becoming thicker again after a period of 200 years of gradually melting down, according to an expert. So if it was the coldest period in 200 years in Norway. Now let's go back and look at the National Climate Assessment graph. They started in 1960 because it was really cold in 1960. By starting their graph then, they can create an upward trend, when in fact the real trend is downward since the 1930s. This is not science. This is corruption. And what about the 1970s? Time Magazine, Science, Another Ice Age, Monday, June 24th, 1974. Telltale signs are everywhere, from the unexpected persistence and thickness of pack ice in the waters around Iceland to the southward migration of a warm-loving creature like the armadillo from the Midwest. Since the 1940s, the mean global temperature has dropped about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. So if scientists have known what controls the climate for the last 150 years, as the National Climate Assessment claims, why were they talking about a new ice age in 1974? The press was full of stories from that period of time about another ice age coming in. A recent Japanese study found the weather during the past 10 years has been bizarre, with droughts, severe cold waves, heavy rains, and unusual warm spells. This pattern of major deviations from weather shows no sign of abating. Global cooling. We can call the cooling trend ominous in the sense that if it continues long enough, it will eventually get us into all kinds of trouble, said Dr. J. Murray Mitchell, climatologist with NOAA. So everything that now gets blamed on global warming was being blamed on global cooling 40 years ago. Droughts, severe cold waves, heavy rains, and unusual warm spells. If you believe climate scientists, then the symptoms of global cooling and global warming are exactly the same. Here's another similar article from the Des Moines Register from 1974. Droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes have plagued much of the nation and the world in recent years. Climatologists now believe for the long run there is a mounting evidence of a worldwide cooling trend. So a worldwide cooling trend could cause all these horrible things. Now scientists tell you they're 97% certain that those things are caused by global warming. And just like now, scientists wanted to control the weather. As science learns more about the weather and climate, more schemes to control them are suggested. Soviet scientists have discussed damming the Bering Strait and pumping Arctic Ocean waters into the Pacific, or diverting the Great Siberian rivers northward. Both projects would partly melt the polar ice caps and raise global temperatures. So these climate scientists were blaming all this bad weather on too much Arctic ice, and they wanted to melt the Arctic to stop bad weather. Well, now climate scientists claim that bad weather is caused by melting Arctic ice. And now climate scientists are talking about weather modification schemes to increase Arctic ice and thus end bad weather. So when there was a lot of Arctic ice, climate scientists blamed the bad weather on it. And when there was little Arctic ice, climate scientists also blame the bad weather on it. It's almost like they don't know what they're talking about. And then the National Climate Assessment has the gall to say that this has been understood for 150 years. What's been understood? That global warming causes bad weather or global cooling causes bad weather? This story is pretty awful so far, but it gets much worse. Let's look now at another part of the corruption. Let's look some more at that article from the Des Moines Register from 1974. World is getting cooler. Global cooling may be a cause of the devastating African drought now in its sixth year. Some scientists believe that expansion of the cold polar air caps pushed the monsoon rate belt southward, causing many of the life-giving rains to fall on already fertile lands or into the sea. Well, now climate scientists blame expansion of the cold polar air caps as being due to global warming. I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a minute, but let's look at this graph. This graph is from the National Center for Atmospheric Research. It shows that temperatures plummeted after the 1940s and were actually colder in 1970 than they were in 1870. Here's a 1974 article from Walter R. Roberts, who is director of the National Center for Atmospheric Research. In February of 1972, Earth-orbiting artificial satellites revealed the existence of a greatly increased area of the snow and ice cover of the North Polar Cap as compared to all previous years of space-age observations. The Earth may have entered a new little ice age. There are strong signs that these recent climate disasters were not random deviations from the usual weather, but instead signals of the emergence of a new normal for world climate. If so, it's a normal that will be far less favorable to global agriculture and thus to world food supplies. So 45 years ago, the director of the world's most prestigious climate institution was talking about global cooling causing disasters. He was talking about a new little ice age. And yet, for some reason, the National Climate Assessment claims that the science has been settled for 150 years. If you go up to the National Center for Atmospheric Research Museum, they talk a lot about Walter R. Roberts, who was a great guy. But what they describe him as is a pioneer in climate change. What they don't tell you is he was talking about global cooling, not global warming. New York Times, December 29, 1974. A number of climatologists point to signs both great, a steady global cooling trend since World War II, and quaint, the southward retreat from Nebraska of the warmth-loving armadillo, to support their claim that the coming years will feature colder, more erratic weather. Some recent warnings from reputable researchers in Japan, Europe, and the U.S. have so worried policymakers that last January certain scientists at a meeting of the National Academy of Sciences proposed the evacuation of some 6 million people. Wow, they wanted to rescue those 6 million people from global cooling. But that was 1974. According to the National Climate Assessment, the science has been settled for 150 years. New York Times, August 8, 1974. Climate changes endanger world's food output. A recent meeting of climate experts in Bonn, West Germany, produced the unanimous conclusion that the change in global weather pattern, global cooling, poses a threat to agriculture that could lead to major crop failures and mass starvation. So global cooling causes all kinds of disasters and is going to make everyone starve to death. And here's June 12, 1974, Greeley Tribune. Boulder scientists see end of period of favorable weather. That's Walter R. Roberts on the right, the director of NCAR, and on the left was their most famous scientist, Stephen Schneider. Food shortages, unstable climate, crop losses, starvation for millions. Underlying Schneider's ideas on food shortages is the knowledge that the world is moving into a period of cooler temperatures. So cold is what causes the problems, not the heat. The heat was good times, the cold is bad times. But the National Climate Assessment says global warming's been settled for 150 years. January 29th, 1974, The Guardian, the most famous climate alarmist newspaper, said, "Space satellites show new ice age coming fast. Worldwide and rapid trends towards a mini ice age are emerging from the first long-term analysis of satellite weather pictures." But the National Climate Assessment said this has been settled for 150 years. December 3rd, 1972, 42 top American and European investigators sent a letter to President Nixon warning of a new ice age within a century. Here's an article from National Geographic from 1977. From 1880 to about 1940, the world, particularly the northern hemisphere, went through a period of significant warming. So Dr. J. Murray Mitchell of NOAA, one of this nation's most respected climatologists, he went on, but since about 1940 there's been a distinct drop in average global temperature. England's annual growing season shrank by 9 or 10 days between 1950 and 1966, Hubert Lamb has noted. In the northern tier of the U.S. Midwest, summer frosts again occasionally damage crops. Sea ice has returned to Iceland's coasts after more than 40 years of virtual absence. Here's a statement from the U.S. National Science Board. During the last 20 to 30 years, world temperature has fallen, irregularly at first, but more sharply over the last decade. Glaciers in Alaska and Scandinavia have slowed the recession. Some in Switzerland have begun advancing again. And on the right, Newsweek, April 28, 1975, The Cooling World. Climatologists wanted to melt the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot. That was their solution to global cooling. March 11th, 1979. One thing is indisputable. The world has been cooling off since World War II. New York Times, January 5th, 1978. An international team of specialists has concluded from 8 indices of climate that there's no end in sight to the cooling trend of the last 30 years. And here's another topic I'm going to touch on again in a minute. A gradual increase in the area of the northern circumpolar vortex, the massive flow of frigid air around the Arctic, has been recorded. So back then they were blaming the polar vortex on global cooling. Now scientists blame it on global warming. So going back to the policymaker graph from the National Climate Assessment, which doesn't show anything prior to 1960, it becomes pretty obvious why. The 1960s and 1970s were very cold, and it was very warm prior to that. So the people who wrote the National Climate Assessment don't want the public to know about temperatures prior to the 1960s because they were very warm, and that ruins their scam of blaming the weather on carbon dioxide. Here's another graph from the National Academy of Sciences from 1975 showing the sharp cooling after 1940 and all the data that's being hidden in the National Climate Assessment Policymaker and Journalist page. But this fraud is much worse than it seems. The data is not only being hidden, it's actually being altered. The black line is the 1974 NCAR graph, which showed the sharp cooling after the 1940s over land surfaces. The red line is the NASA current land surface graph. They've completely erased the post-1940 cooling. NASA has simply changed the data because it's not convenient for their theory. Now let's look at the polar vortex scam. Climate scientists told us for years and years that global warming had ruined winters. We don't get cold winters like we used to. We don't get snowy winters like we used to, and we were never going to get them back. But then we started getting cold, snowy winters again, so they needed an explanation for what was going on. So they started blaming the polar vortex, which was bringing all this cold, snowy weather down to the U.S., on melting Arctic ice and Arctic warming. A deep chill covered much of the eastern half of the United States this winter. Winds known as the polar vortex did not blow in as tight a formation as they have in the past. When they loosened, they let Arctic air spill south, seen by the blue in this picture. Atmospheric scientist Jennifer Francis of Rutgers University says that this pattern can be blamed on Arctic warming. So they say that the super cold air, which is coming all the way south into the deep south and freezing everything, is a result of the Arctic being really warm and melting. And here's an article by Phil Plait, the astronomer and climate alarmist, who's very angry about the cold weather. A scary reminder that climate deniers will feel emboldened by Trump's election. Trump's team is already planning to cut global warming research at NASA. As winter approaches, we'll likely see more reality-challenged senators bring snowballs to the floor in Congress and say, "What global warming?" every time a cold snap arrives, even though a lot of the brutal polar vortex conditions are actually tied to the effects of global warming. So once again, he's presenting this theory that the Arctic is warm and melting and full of this very warm air, and that's causing frigid air to come down into Florida? How does warm, melting Arctic air get cold when it comes down into the deep south? You can't claim that the air at the North Pole is very warm and the ice is melting, and also claim that the air is frigid when it comes down to Florida. It makes absolutely no sense to do that. But here's the real kicker. This is the jet stream map, which they're blaming on global warming. This big dip down the middle of the country down into northern Florida, then back up along the east coast. And this is blamed on global warming. But if you look at National Geographic from 1977, we see exactly the same jet stream pattern, and that was blamed on global cooling. So global cooling, global warming, they both produce exactly the same jet stream pattern and the same polar vortex. The difference is that it actually makes sense to associate cold with global cooling. It makes no sense to associate it with global warming. So 40 years ago, climate scientists were quite a bit more honest than they are now. So let's look at what was going on in January of 1977. National Geographic described it as the year the weather went wild. The orange crop in Florida froze. It actually snowed in Miami in January 1977, the only time that's ever happened. In January 1977, Alaska was warmer than Florida. And if we look at the jet stream map from 1977, we can see why. There was a big ridge up over the west, up into Alaska, and then a dip bringing cold air down into Florida. Exactly the same pattern as recent winters. And once again, in 1974, scientists blamed the polar vortex and dips in the jet stream on global cooling. Time, another ice age. Science, June 24th, 1974. Scientists have found other indications of global cooling. For one thing, there's been a noticeable expansion of the great belt of dry, high-altitude polar winds, the so-called circumpolar vortex that sweep from west to east around the top and bottom of the world. So looking again at what scientists are saying now, they're saying that these big dips in the jet stream and the polar vortex are caused by missing Arctic ice. So what about the deep dips in the jet stream and the cold polar vortex from the winters of 1977 through 1979? Well, you may remember this graph from some of my previous videos. That was peak Arctic ice. So climate scientists are blaming the identical weather patterns and polar vortex from the late 1970s on missing Arctic ice, but back then it was peak Arctic ice. Obviously, these climate scientists have absolutely no clue what they're talking about. Donald Trump has been onto their scam for a very long time. Here's a tweet he made in 2011. Newly released emails prove that scientists have manipulated data on global warming. The data is unreliable. Well, Donald Trump was exactly right about it then, and he's exactly right about it now. But just as President Eisenhower warned, we have this group of scientific technological elite who are trying to take control of policy away from the president. And there seems to be no limit to how big a lie they're willing to tell in order to make this happen. So let's look at what's really going on with these climate scientists. Ottmar Edenhofer in 2010, who's a bigwig at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said, "We, UN IPCC, redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore." This is not about science. Nothing these people are doing has anything to do with the scientific method. It's as far from it as I can possibly imagine. So let's review what this group of scientific technological elite are doing. They're hiding inconvenient data. They're altering data to match their theory. They're making false claims about the data. They're engaging in politics. They're trying to bully politicians with appeals to authority. They're engaging in censorship. They defund skeptical scientists. They ostracize skeptical scientists, and they attempt to bully skeptical scientists. Just today, Chuck Todd from Meet the Press said he wasn't going to allow any climate deniers on his show. If these climate alarmists had any position to stand on, they would be eager to debate skeptics, put us down, put us away for good, and have us stop causing them problems. Instead, they lie, censor, and do dirty tricks. Donald Trump threatens their funding. Reckless. Why is Barack Obama wasting over $70 billion on climate change activities? Will he ever learn? We see a full court press going on from climate alarmists now to try to seize control away from the person who's supposed to be making policy and hand it over to the scientific technological elite, which are a few hacks like Michael Mann and Catherine Hayhoe, the unelected fraudsters who make up the climate industrial complex. We're living in the dangerous times which President Eisenhower warned us about 60 years ago, and it's up to all of us to get the message out and end this madness. Do we want a Soviet-style government where information and policy is controlled by censorship, lies, and bullying? Or do we want the government, free press, free speech, and constitutional rights which our founding fathers fought and died for? It's up to every one of us to take action, do our part, and get the word out. I'm going to end this video with a couple of television clips from the time which the National Climate Assessment doesn't want you to remember.
In 1977, the worst winter in a century struck the United States. Arctic cold gripped the Midwest for weeks on end. Great blizzards paralyzed cities of the Northeast. One desperate night in Buffalo, 8 people froze to death in marooned cars. Pat Bushnell was on the road that night.
Traffic just absolutely stopped. I was afraid of being stuck in the car all night long with the cold and the wind running out of gas. And then what? I think that if we had to go through a real bad winter, just like we just went through, I think we'd have to think about moving someplace else.
Move where? The brutal Buffalo winter might become common all over the United States. Climate experts believe the next ice age is on its way. According to recent evidence, it could come sooner than anyone had expected. At weather stations in the far north, temperatures have been dropping for 30 years. Seacoasts, long free of summer ice, are now blocked year-round. According to some climatologists, within a lifetime, we might be living in the next ice age.
British professor Hubert Lamb says that a new ice age is creeping over the northern hemisphere. Even then, it won't be as bad as the last ice age 60,000 years ago. Then New York, Cincinnati, St. Louis were under 5,000 feet of ice. Presumably, no traffic moved and school was let out for the day. And that's the way it is, Monday, September 11th, 1972.